What happens when Hollywood's most beloved friend meets late-night television's most unpredictable host? You won't believe what unfolds when a simple promotional interview transforms into the most explosive confrontation in talk show history. Last night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live delivered drama that nobody saw coming, as Jennifer Aniston found herself in the crosshairs of her host's increasingly aggressive questioning. The tension was palpable from the moment she walked onto that stage. But what started as typical celebrity banter quickly spiraled into something far more sinister. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when Hollywood politeness collides with late-night ruthlessness. The studio audience had no idea they were about to witness television history in the making. Jennifer Aniston, radiant in a sleek black dress, settled into the guest chair with her characteristic warm smile, ready to promote her latest project. The atmosphere seemed normal enough, the familiar desk setup, the house band finishing their musical flourish, and Jimmy Kimmel wearing his trademark smirk as he shuffled through his note cards. But something felt different tonight. There was an edge to Kimmel's demeanor, a sharpness in his eyes that suggested this wouldn't be the typical softball interview that A-list celebrities usually expect. The opening moments played out exactly as scripted. Kimmel welcomed Aniston with his usual theatrical enthusiasm, cracking jokes about her timeless beauty and making reference to her iconic role on Friends. The audience laughed on cue. Aniston responded with gracious charm, and everything seemed to be following the well-worn path of celebrity promotion. She discussed her new streaming series with genuine enthusiasm, sharing behind-the-scenes stories and praising her co-stars. The conversation flowed smoothly, punctuated by audience applause and Kimmel's seemingly supportive interjections. But then something shifted. As Aniston was mid-sentence, describing the challenges of producing and starring in her latest project, Kimmel interrupted with a question that caught everyone off guard. His tone had changed. Gone was the playful banter, replaced by something that felt almost predatory. He leaned forward in his chair, his expression suddenly serious, and asked about her recent divorce proceedings with a level of detail that made the studio audience visibly uncomfortable. Aniston's smile faltered for just a moment, her media training kicking in as she attempted to deflect with humor. She laughed nervously and tried to steer the conversation back to her work, but Kimmel wasn't having it. He pressed harder, asking increasingly personal questions about her relationships, her choices, and her life decisions. The audience, sensing the shift in energy, grew quiet. This wasn't the light-hearted entertainment they'd come to expect from late-night television. The actress maintained her composure admirably, but there was a visible tension in her shoulders now. She crossed and uncrossed her legs, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her dress as she continued to try to redirect the conversation. Kimmel, however, seemed emboldened by her discomfort. He made a comment about her pattern of failed relationships that drew audible gasps from the audience. The camera caught Aniston's face perfectly, the momentary flash of hurt and anger before she composed herself again. What happened next would become the talk of social media within hours. Kimmel, perhaps misreading the room or simply not caring about the growing tension, decided to double down. He brought up tabloid rumors that had been circulating for months, treating them as established fact rather than speculation. He questioned her choices as a woman, her priorities in life, and made thinly veiled suggestions about her personal relationships that crossed every line of professional interviewing. The studio atmosphere had become thick with uncomfortable tension. Audience members were shifting in their seats, some looking around nervously as if seeking an exit. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every moment of this increasingly awkward exchange. Aniston's publicist, visible in the wings, was frantically trying to get the attention of the show's producers, but the interview continued its downward spiral. Kimmel then made the fatal mistake that would transform this uncomfortable interview into a full-blown confrontation. He referenced a recent tabloid story about Aniston's personal life, not just mentioning it, but elaborating on it with a level of detail that suggested he'd done extensive research into her private affairs. He spoke about her as if she weren't sitting right there, analyzing her life choices like a case study rather than treating her as a human being deserving of basic respect. The moment those words left his mouth, something fundamental changed in Jennifer Aniston's demeanor. The practiced Hollywood smile disappeared entirely, replaced by a look of genuine shock and growing anger. She sat up straighter in her chair, her hands now clenched in her lap, and for the first time that evening, she looked directly into Kimmel's eyes with an intensity that made the host finally pause his relentless questioning. The silence that followed was deafening. The audience held its collective breath, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't scripted television anymore. This was real, raw human emotion playing out in real time. Aniston's chest rose and fell as she took a deep breath, clearly trying to decide how to respond to this unprecedented breach of professional courtesy. When she finally spoke, her voice was controlled but carried an unmistakable edge of steel. She addressed Kimmel directly, her words carefully chosen but loaded with meaning. She called out his unprofessional behavior, his invasion of her privacy, and his apparent lack of respect for her as both a guest and a human being. The audience, recognizing the gravity of the moment, remained silent, hanging on every word. But Kimmel, rather than backing down or apologizing, seemed to interpret her response as a challenge. He leaned back in his chair with a smug expression, as if he'd successfully provoked the reaction he'd been seeking all along. His next words would prove to be the point of no return, the moment when this uncomfortable interview would transform into something far more explosive, setting the stage for what would become one of the most dramatic exits in television history. "Oh, come on, Jennifer," Kimmel said with a dismissive wave of his hand, his voice dripping with condescension. "You can't honestly tell me you didn't expect these questions. You're a public figure. This comes with the territory. Maybe if you made better choices in your personal life, we wouldn't have so much to talk about." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and the audience's collective intake of breath was audible even through the television microphones. Aniston's eyes widened in disbelief. For a moment, she seemed genuinely stunned that a professional interviewer would speak to her this way on national television. The color drained from her face, then returned with a vengeance as anger began to replace shock. She uncrossed her legs and leaned forward, her voice steady but unmistakably furious when she responded. "Excuse me," she said, each word precisely enunciated. "Did you just blame me for your complete lack of professionalism? I came here to talk about my work, Jimmy, not to be psychoanalyzed by someone who clearly has no understanding of boundaries or basic human decency." The audience was completely silent now, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented in late-night television. Kimmel's smirk only widened. He was clearly enjoying this confrontation, feeding off the tension he'd created. "Look, I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. The whole America's sweetheart thing is getting a little old, don't you think? Maybe it's time to drop the act and be honest about why your relationships keep failing." His words were calculated to wound, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who'd forgotten he was speaking to a human being. The studio audience began to murmur uncomfortably. Several people in the front row were visibly cringing, and some were shaking their heads in disapproval. The cameras caught it all, the audience's growing discomfort, Aniston's mounting anger, and Kimmel's apparent satisfaction with the chaos he'd created. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was a public humiliation being broadcast to millions. Aniston stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent studio. "I'm not going to sit here and let you attack me for your audience's entertainment," she said, her voice rising with each word. "What you're doing right now is not journalism. It's not comedy. It's just cruelty. And I won't be part of it." But Kimmel wasn't finished. As Aniston moved to leave, he called out after her with a comment that would become the most replayed moment of the entire disaster. "Running away again, Jennifer? That seems to be your specialty." The words were like a slap across the face, and the audience gasped audibly. Several people in the front row were now standing, as if they couldn't bear to watch what was happening. Aniston stopped dead in her tracks, her back still to Kimmel and the audience. For a long moment, she stood perfectly still, her hands clenched. At her sides, the silence stretched on, becoming increasingly unbearable. When she finally turned around, her face was a mask of controlled fury that made even Kimmel's smug expression falter slightly. "You want to know what my specialty is, Jimmy?" she said, her voice now carrying a dangerous edge that made the entire studio hold its breath. "It's recognizing when someone is trying to build their career on tearing down others. It's calling out bullies who hide behind their desk and their audience, thinking they're untouchable. She took a step closer to his desk, her presence commanding the entire room. The host, perhaps realizing he'd pushed too far, attempted to backtrack with a nervous laugh. Hey, look, I was just trying to have some fun here. You know how this works, it's all part of the show. But his voice lacked its earlier confidence, and there was something almost desperate in his attempt to frame his behavior as harmless entertainment. Aniston's laugh was sharp and bitter. Fun? You think publicly humiliating your guests is fun? You think using your platform to spread gossip and attack people's personal lives is entertainment? This isn't comedy, Jimmy. This is just mean-spirited cruelty dressed up as humor. Her words cut through the studio like a blade, and even the production crew visible in the background seemed frozen by the intensity of the moment. The audience was now completely divided. Some were applauding Aniston's response, clearly supporting her against what they saw as Kimmel's inappropriate behavior. Others sat in stunned silence, unsure how to react to this unprecedented breakdown of the typical talk show format. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every moment of this career-defining confrontation. Kimmel, sensing he was losing control of the situation, made one final desperate attempt to regain his authority. He stood up from behind his desk, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate his guest. Listen, Jennifer, I think you're overreacting here. This is how interviews work. If you can't handle a few tough questions, maybe you shouldn't be doing publicity. His voice carried a threatening undertone that made several audience members visibly uncomfortable. The moment those words left his mouth, something fundamental shifted in the studio's atmosphere. Aniston's expression changed from anger to something far more dangerous, a cold, calculating fury that made even the most seasoned Hollywood professionals take notice. She had reached her breaking point, and everyone in that studio knew that what happened next would define not just this interview, but potentially both of their careers. Tough questions, she repeated, her voice now deadly quiet. Jimmy, asking about someone's work, their process, their inspiration, those are tough questions. What you've been doing tonight is character assassination. There's a difference between journalism and voyeurism, and you've crossed that line so completely that you can't even see it anymore. Her words were delivered with surgical precision, each one designed to expose the fundamental flaws in his approach. The host's face was now flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. He had clearly expected Aniston to back down, to play along with his aggressive style, but instead she had called him out publicly and effectively. The audience could sense that this confrontation was about to reach its explosive climax, and the tension in the room was almost unbearable. What happened next would become the most talked-about moment in late-night television history, as Aniston prepared to deliver the final blow that would expose Kimmel's behavior for what it really was, setting the stage for her dramatic exit that would leave the entire studio in stunned silence. Aniston took a deep breath, her composure returning with the kind of steel that had made her one of Hollywood's most enduring stars. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of decades of experience dealing with media scrutiny, but also the fury of someone who had finally reached her limit. You know what, Jimmy? I've been in this business for over 30 years, and I've sat through hundreds of interviews with hosts who actually understand what their job is supposed to be. Your job isn't to tear people down for entertainment. Your job isn't to exploit personal pain for ratings. Your job is to make your guests feel welcome while giving your audience something worth watching. She paused, letting her words sink in, before continuing. Tonight, you failed spectacularly at all of those things. The audience began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to a sustained ovation that seemed to give Aniston even more strength. Kimmel's face was now a mask of barely controlled rage. His earlier smugness completely evaporated. He had clearly expected her to crumble under his pressure, but instead she was dismantling his entire approach with surgical precision. And another thing, Aniston continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. You want to talk about failed relationships? Let's talk about your failed understanding of basic human decency. Let's talk about how you've turned what should be a celebration of creativity and achievement into a public flogging for your own twisted entertainment. The audience was now on their feet, their applause becoming more enthusiastic with each devastating point she made. Kimmel, desperate to regain control, tried to interrupt with a weak attempt at humor. Come on, Jennifer, don't you think you're being a little dramatic here? It's just television. We're all friends here. But his voice cracked slightly, betraying his growing panic as he realized that his usual tactics weren't working. The audience's reaction made it clear that they were firmly on Aniston's side. Friends. Aniston's laugh was sharp and incredulous. Jimmy, friends don't ambush each other on national television. Friends don't use private information as weapons. Friends don't try to humiliate each other for sport. She gestured toward the audience, who were now openly cheering her on. Look around you. These people came here to be entertained, not to watch you bully your guests. You've turned your own audience against you. The host's desperation was now palpable. He attempted to play the victim, claiming that celebrities should expect this kind of treatment, that it was all part of the game. But each word only made him look smaller and more pathetic. The cameras caught every moment of his meltdown, from his nervous fidgeting to the sweat beginning to form on his forehead. Aniston moved closer to his desk, her presence now completely dominating the stage. You want to know what's really sad, Jimmy? You have a platform that millions of people watch. You could use that platform to celebrate talent, to inspire people, to bring joy into their lives. Instead, you've chosen to use it as a weapon. That's not comedy. That's not entertainment. That's just cruelty. The audience erupted in the loudest applause of the night, many people now standing and cheering openly. The sound was thunderous, drowning out any attempt Kimmel might make to respond. The cameras panned across the crowd, showing faces filled with admiration for Aniston's courage and disgust for Kimmel's behavior. But Aniston wasn't finished. She had one final devastating blow to deliver, and she delivered it with the kind of precision that comes from years of dealing with Hollywood's worst impulses. You know what the really pathetic part is, Jimmy? You're not even good at being mean. You're just a sad little man hiding behind a desk, trying to feel important by making other people feel small. But tonight, you've shown everyone exactly who you really are. The words hit Kimmel like a physical blow. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, humiliation, and finally, a kind of defeated recognition that he had lost this battle completely. The audience's reaction was immediate and overwhelming, with people now openly laughing at his expense while applauding Aniston's masterful takedown. And you know what the worst part is? Aniston continued, her voice now carrying a note of genuine sadness. I actually used to respect you. I thought you were one of the good ones. But tonight, you've shown me that you're just another bully with a microphone, hiding behind your writers and your audience, thinking that gives you the right to tear people down. The studio had become electric with tension and excitement. The audience was completely captivated by this unprecedented display of raw honesty and courage. Even the production crew, normally invisible behind their cameras and equipment, were watching in fascination as this historic confrontation reached its climax. Kimmel made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Look, Jennifer, I think maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't we start over? But his voice was weak and unconvincing, and the audience's immediate chorus of boos made it clear that his credibility was completely shot. Aniston looked at him with something approaching pity. Jimmy, there's no starting over from this. You've shown your true colors tonight, and everyone in this room and everyone watching at home has seen exactly what kind of person you really are. I hope it was worth it, because this is going to follow you for the rest of your career. With that, she turned away from the desk and began walking toward the exit. The audience rose to their feet in a sustained standing ovation that seemed to shake the entire studio. The sound was deafening, a thunderous expression of support for her courage and condemnation of Kimmel's behavior. As she reached the edge of the stage, Aniston turned back one final time. To everyone watching at home, you deserve better than this. You deserve hosts who treat their guests with respect, who understand that their job is to entertain you, not to destroy people for your amusement. Don't let anyone tell you that cruelty is entertainment. The applause reached a crescendo as she disappeared backstage, leaving Kimmel alone at his desk, his face a mask of humiliation and defeat. The audience continued to cheer, many of them now chanting Aniston's name. The cameras captured every moment of Kimmel's mortification as he realized that his attempt to dominate his guest had backfired spectacularly. For several long moments, Kimmel sat in stunned silence, unable to speak or move. The audience's applause gradually died down, replaced by an awkward silence that seemed to stretch on forever. When he finally attempted to speak, his voice was barely audible, completely stripped of its earlier arrogance. "Well, I guess that's all for tonight, folks," he managed to stammer, his usual sign-off completely abandoned. The show's theme music began to play, but it sounded hollow and inappropriate after what had just transpired. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every moment of his humiliation as the credits began to roll over his devastated expression. The audience filed out in animated conversation, many of them pulling out their phones to share what they had just witnessed. The studio, which had been electric with tension just moments before, now felt empty and deflated. Kimmel remained at his desk, staring into space, clearly realizing that his career had just taken a devastating hit from which it might never recover. What had started as a routine celebrity interview had transformed into a masterclass in standing up to bullies and a devastating exposure of the dark side of entertainment culture. Jennifer Aniston's courage in calling out Kimmel's behavior had created a moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come, a reminder that even in Hollywood, there are still people willing to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost.